When you turn on your tap, the clean water that flows out has almost certainly traveled a very long journey to finally reach you, and for a great many Americans that journey begins in a river. Across the country, rivers are the source of the drinking water for tens of millions of people. The flowing supply that fills the reservoirs, feeds the treatment plants, and ends up in the glasses. The showers and the kitchens of homes in cities and towns large and small. But some of these vital rivers are shrinking, their flows diminishing under the pressures of drought, a warming climate, and a demand that keeps growing, and because so many people depend on them for the most basic of necessities, their steady decline is a matter of real and pressing concern. This is the story of several American rivers that are shrinking, rivers that supply water to millions, and of what their decline means for the people who depend on them. It is a journey across the country, from the deserts of the West to the great cities of the East, to understand how the shrinking of these rivers touches the daily lives of ordinary people. Before we begin, one honest word. To say these rivers are shrinking and supply water to millions does not mean the taps are about to run dry or that disaster is imminent. It means these rivers face real and growing stress, that the water they provide can no longer be taken for granted, and that understanding their plight is the first step toward protecting the supply on which so many depend. Quick honest word before we dive in. A lot of people watch these all the way through, love them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a channel like ours going: hitting subscribe. If you are finding this important, take 1 second and subscribe right now. It genuinely matters for us and costs you nothing. And drop your state in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. Why rivers that supply millions are shrinking before we visit the rivers themselves. It helps to understand why they are shrinking, because the same forces appear again and again across the country, threatening rivers in every region. The first is drought, the prolonged stretches of dry weather that reduce the rain and snow feeding the rivers and draw down their flows. In some regions, the drought has been severe and long-lasting, while in others it comes and goes. But wherever it strikes, it immediately reduces the water in the rivers and in the reservoirs that store it for the cities. Drought is the most visible and immediate driver of the shrinking, the dry spell that everyone can feel. Layered on top of drought is the warming of the climate, which reduces the rivers in ways that go beyond a simple lack of rain. Higher temperatures increase the evaporation of water from the rivers and reservoirs, dry out the soils so they absorb more water before it can reach the rivers, and change the behavior of the mountain snowpack that feeds so many streams. So that even in years with reasonable precipitation, less water ultimately reaches the flow. This warming-driven decline is a persistent force operating year after year, independent of any single drought. And then there is demand, the ever-growing thirst of expanding populations, which draws more and more water from the rivers to supply the millions who depend on them. Together, these three forces, drought, warming, and demand, are shrinking the rivers, and because these rivers supply the drinking water for so many people, their decline is felt directly in the homes and lives of ordinary Americans. Understanding these forces helps to reveal why the shrinking of the rivers is such a serious concern, because the pressures driving it are not going away and may well intensify in the years ahead. The Colorado River, supplying the thirsty Southwest. We begin with the most famous and most stressed of America's shrinking rivers, the Colorado, which supplies drinking water to tens of millions of people across the arid Southwest. The Colorado rises in the Rocky Mountains and flows more than 1,000 miles across the desert, its water captured in great reservoirs and carried through canals and aqueducts to reach cities and homes far from its banks. It supplies water to great desert metropolises, cities of millions that could never have grown to their current size without it. And for these cities, the Colorado is the foundational source, the river whose flow fills the taps of their residents each day. When you consider the sheer number of people who drink the Colorado's water, you begin to grasp the scale of what is at stake in its decline. But the Colorado has been shrinking dramatically, drained by more than 2 decades of drought, intensified by a warming climate, and burdened by a demand that has long exceeded what the river reliably provides. Its great reservoirs have fallen to historic lows, and the states that share the river have been forced into difficult negotiations to reduce their use and keep the system from collapsing. The decline of the Colorado is the most prominent example of a shrinking American river, a crisis that threatens the drinking water of an entire region. The millions who depend on the Colorado for their most basic needs face a future of less water, of conservation and hard choices, and of the urgent need to bring their use into balance with what the river can sustain. The Colorado stands at the head of our journey as the great example of a river that supplies water to millions and that is now shrinking, a reminder of how much depends on the flow of a single stream in a thirsty land, and of how directly the decline of a river can touch the lives of the people who drink its water. What makes the Colorado's situation particularly sobering is that the reservoirs which store its water, the great buffers that have long guaranteed a reliable supply, have themselves fallen to levels that expose just how precarious the situation has become. These reservoirs were built to hold years' worth of water, a reserve against the dry times. But the sustained decline of the river has drawn them down toward the thresholds at which the whole system of supply begins to break, and the cities that depend on them have had to confront the possibility, once unthinkable, that the water might one day fail. This is the reality that the millions who depend on the Colorado now live with. A reminder that even the most elaborate systems of storage and delivery cannot fully protect against a river that is simply carrying less water than it used to. Here is something I would genuinely love to know, and it takes 10 seconds. Did you have any idea that a single river supplies drinking water to tens of millions of people? Drop a yes or no in the comments, because your answers help us understand what surprises people most, and I read every reply. Okay, back to the rivers. The Rio Grande, a lifeline for the border region, our second river, carries us to the southwest border, to the Rio Grande, which supplies water to communities, farms, and cities across a vast and arid region straddling the boundary between the United States and Mexico. The Rio Grande rises in the mountains and flows southward through New Mexico and along the Texas border. Its water drawn upon by all who live along its length, and for the cities and communities of this dry region, it is a precious and irreplaceable source of drinking water, one whose flow has supported life for centuries. Millions of people on both sides of the border depend on the Rio Grande, making its health a matter of the greatest importance to the entire region. But the Rio Grande has been running low, stressed by the same forces of drought, warming, and demand that afflict the Colorado. In the driest years, stretches of the river have run so low that they have gone dry entirely, the water vanishing from the riverbed in places where it once flowed, a stark and alarming sign of the pressure on this vital stream. The diminished snowpack that feeds the river, the increased evaporation and drought driven by the warming climate, and the heavy demand for the water all combine to reduce the Rio Grande, threatening the drinking water of the communities that depend on it. The millions who rely on the Rio Grande face the challenge of a river that can no longer be counted on to provide as it once did. And its decline is a reminder that the shrinking of America's rivers is a challenge shared across borders, affecting entire regions bound together by their dependence on a single diminishing flow. The Rio Grande, running low in the desert, is a powerful symbol of the stress on the rivers that supply the arid Southwest. The rivers of California, feeding cities and farms, our third stop, takes us to California, to the great river system of the state's Central Valley, where the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers and their tributaries gather the water that supplies both the cities of the state and one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world. These rivers, fed by the snowpack of the great mountains that ring the valley, are drawn upon to supply the drinking water of millions of Californians and to irrigate the fields that make the state such an agricultural powerhouse. The reach of these rivers extends far, their water carried through an elaborate system to supply cities across the state, so that they sustain a vast population as well as the farms that feed much of the nation. But these rivers have been under severe stress, squeezed by California's cycle of drought and by the enormous demand placed upon their water. In the dry years, the flows diminish, the snowpack that feeds them shrinks, and the competition for the water intensifies among the cities, the farms, and the needs of the environment. When the rivers run low, the cities face restrictions, the farms cut back their planting, and the delicate balance of the great delta where the rivers meet comes under threat. The heavy reliance on these rivers, combined with the pressures of drought and a warming climate, has drawn them down and strained the systems that depend on them. The rivers of California supply water to millions and grow food for many more, and their decline threatens not only the state that depends on them directly, but the food supply of the entire nation, tying the fate of these distant waters to tables everywhere. They are a reminder that the shrinking of America's rivers reaches into both the taps and the tables of the country. California's situation is made all the more complex by the enormous scale and variety of the demands on its water, for the same rivers that supply the great coastal cities also irrigate the vast farms of the interior and sustain the ecosystems of the delta and the rivers themselves, all competing for a supply that swings dramatically between wet and dry years. When a drought strikes, these competing demands come into sharp conflict, and the state must make painful choices about how to allocate the shrinking water among the cities, the farms, and the environment. The rivers of California thus sit at the center of some of the most difficult water decisions in the country, and their decline forces a reckoning with the reality that there is not enough water to fully satisfy every demand, a reckoning that grows harder with each dry year and each degree of additional warming. Quick pause, because this matters and deserves to be seen. If you are getting value from this, tap the like button. It really does help the video reach more people. And if you have family or friends who care about where their water comes from, share this with them, because it is genuinely important to understand. One like, one share to someone you care about, and let's keep going. The Delaware River, quietly supplying the great cities of the East. Our fourth river may surprise you, because it lies not in the arid west, but in the well-watered east, and yet it supplies drinking water to some of the largest cities in the country. The Delaware River, which flows through the mid-Atlantic region, is a vital source of water for a vast population, supplying millions of people in great eastern metropolitan areas, including some of the biggest cities in the nation, whose water is drawn from the river and its watershed and carried to their taps. Most people in these cities have no idea that their water comes from the Delaware, and yet the river quietly sustains their daily lives, a hidden lifeline for a huge population in a densely settled region. Even in the humid East, the Delaware is not immune to the pressures that threaten rivers elsewhere, because periodic droughts can reduce its flow, and the enormous demand placed upon it by the great cities it serves leaves less margin than the region's rainy reputation might suggest. When the river runs low, a particular danger emerges near its mouth, where the reduced flow can allow salt water from the sea to push upstream, threatening the freshwater intakes that supply the cities, a challenge that must be carefully managed to protect the drinking water. The management of the Delaware, shared among several states and great cities, requires careful cooperation to balance the many demands on the river and to guard against the effects of drought. The Delaware illustrates that the shrinking and stress of America's rivers is not only a Western problem, but a national one, reaching even the great cities of the East, and that even in a region of ample rainfall, a river that supplies millions must be watched and managed with care. It is a reminder that no region can take its water entirely for granted in an age of drought and growing demand. The case of the Delaware is especially striking because the great cities it serves lie at some distance from the river, drawing its water across the landscape through an elaborate system of reservoirs and aqueducts, so that millions of people depend on a river many of them have never seen and could not point to on a map. This hidden dependence is common across the country as great cities reach out to distant rivers for their water, and it means that the health of a river matters enormously to people who have no direct connection to it, who simply turn on their taps and expect the water to flow. The Delaware quietly carries this responsibility, supplying a vast population in one of the most densely settled regions of the nation, and its careful management is a quiet triumph that most of those who depend on it never think about, until a drought reminds them how much rests on the flow of the river. The Chattahoochee, the small river behind a great city, our fifth river, brings us to the southeast, to the Chattahoochee, a river that is modest in size, but that carries an outsized importance, because it supplies the drinking water for one of the largest and fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country. The Chattahoochee rises in the mountains and flows southward, supplying water to a great and expanding metropolitan area, and then continuing on to serve communities and farms downstream, across more than one state. For the millions who live in the region it serves, the Chattahoochee is a crucial and heavily relied upon source of drinking water, one whose modest flow must be shared among many competing needs. The Chattahoochee illustrates a surprising truth that a major metropolitan area can depend on a relatively small river, and that such dependence becomes precarious as the population grows and periodic droughts strike. The region has experienced droughts that drop the river and its reservoirs to worrying levels, raising the specter of shortages for the great city that depends on them. And the competition for the water has led to long and bitter disputes among the states that share it. The story of the Chattahoochee shows that the shrinking and stress of America's rivers can arise even in the humid southeast, wherever a growing population presses upon a river that is too small to provide an unlimited supply. It is a reminder that water scarcity is not only a matter of climate, but of the balance between how much a river provides and how much a growing population asks of it, and that even a great and prosperous city can find its water supply strained when it depends on a modest river in a time of growth and drought. As the metropolitan area continues to expand, adding new residents year after year, the demands on the Chattahoochee only increase, so that the margin between what the river provides and what the region needs grows ever thinner, and each dry spell brings the possibility of shortage closer. This is a challenge that many fast-growing regions across the country will increasingly face as expanding populations press upon rivers that were never large enough to provide an unlimited supply, and it makes the Chattahoochee a preview of the pressures that growth and climate together will bring to the nation's rivers. All right, I know, second time I am bringing this up, feel free to sigh at me. But quickly, if you have made it this deep into a video about America's rivers, you clearly care about this stuff, and a lot of you who watch have not subscribed yet. That one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel like ours. No guilt, just a grateful ask. That is the last time promise. Let's finish. The Potomac and the water of the nation's capital, our sixth and final river, takes us to the Potomac, which supplies drinking water to the metropolitan area around the nation's capital, a great and growing population that depends on the river for its most basic needs. The Potomac flows through the mid-Atlantic region and provides the majority of the water for the millions of people in the capital region, making it one of the most important rivers in the country for the sheer number of people and the significance of the population that it sustains. Like the Delaware, the Potomac is a river of the humid east, and yet it too must be watched and managed carefully because the great population it serves places heavy demands on its flow. The Potomac illustrates the vulnerability that even eastern rivers can face, because in times of drought its flow can decline, and the region has had to plan carefully to ensure that enough water remains to supply the cities even in the driest conditions. The management of the Potomac involves careful coordination to store water and to balance the needs of the population against the flow of the river, a reflection of the reality that even in a well-watered region, a river that supplies millions cannot be taken for granted. The reduced flows that can come with drought, combined with the steadily growing demand of an expanding population, mean that the Potomac, like the other rivers on this list, must be managed with foresight and care to keep the water flowing. The Potomac completes our journey across the shrinking and stressed rivers of America, a final reminder that the challenge reaches into every region, even to the river that supplies the nation's own capital, and that the careful stewardship of water is a task that faces the entire country, not only its driest corners. There is a certain symbolism in the fact that even the river of the capital must be watched and managed against the threat of shortage, because it underscores that no place, however important or well-resourced, is exempt from the fundamental challenge of living within the limits of its water. The careful planning that has gone into securing the capital region's water, the reservoirs built to store water for the dry times, the coordination among the jurisdictions that share the river, all reflect a hard-won understanding that even an eastern river serving a great population can fall short in a serious drought, and that the security of the supply depends on foresight and cooperation rather than on the assumption of endless abundance. The Potomac stands as proof that the age of taking water for granted has passed, even in the humid East, even in the capital of the nation. What these rivers really tell us having traveled across the country, from the Colorado to the Potomac. From the deserts of the West to the great cities of the East, we can step back and consider what these rivers tell us together about the state of the nation's water. The first lesson is that the challenge is truly national, reaching into every region, not confined to the obvious dry lands of the West, but touching even the humid east. Where great cities depend on rivers that must be watched and managed as carefully as any in the country. The same forces of drought, a warming climate, and growing demand press upon rivers everywhere, and while the details differ from region to region, the underlying pattern is the same, a growing pressure on the rivers that supply the drinking water of millions. The shrinking and stress of these rivers is a challenge that touches the daily lives of people across the land, and the water that flows from their taps. The second lesson, however, is one of hope as much as concern, because the recognition of the challenge is the beginning of the response, and across the country efforts are underway to protect the rivers and to manage them wisely. Conservation, the more efficient use of water, the careful management of the rivers and reservoirs, the cooperation among the states and cities that share the water, and the effort to bring demand into balance with supply all offer paths toward a more secure future. The rivers can be protected, their flows can be defended, and the millions who depend on them can secure their water if the will and the wisdom are brought to bear. What happens to these rivers and to the many others like them will depend on the choices the nation makes, on whether it can rise to the challenge of stewarding its water in an age of drought and warming and growth. These rivers and the millions who depend on them are a reminder that water is the most precious of resources, that even in a nation as rich and capable as this one, the flow of a river cannot be taken for granted, and that the future of the country is written, in large part, in the health of the rivers that supply its people. The rivers have given so much for so long, and now it is time to protect and cherish them, so that they may continue to supply the millions who depend on them for the generations still to come. For most of the nation's history, Americans could turn on their taps without a thought for the rivers that fed them, confident that the water would always be there. But the shrinking of these vital streams is a signal that this confidence can no longer be taken for granted, and that a new era of care and stewardship must begin if the rivers are